Welcome to the Resilient Biome Podcast. The title today is Worshiping God Through the Wonders of the Microbiome. And I was able to find just a wonderful guest for this topic, Dr. Carlson. He is a professor of biology and chair of the natural sciences, and also the director of interdisciplinary inquiry courses at Trinity Christian College. So welcome, Dr. Carlson. So glad to meet you and have you as a guest here.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm really looking forward to the conversation.
Fantastic. Well, first of all, so our listeners get to know you a little bit. How long have you been teaching at the university level, and how many of those years have been at Trinity Christian?
Sure. This is my 15th year at Trinity, and it's the only place I've served as a professor. When I was coming out of graduate school, I was looking for a place where I could take science really seriously and take God really seriously. And I am so thankful and blessed to have been able to find it right away. And so I landed at Trinity, and I've been here ever since.
Taking God and science very seriously. That's exactly what we want to discuss today. So that's a great intro. I love the statement you included at the top of your bio on the university website. Biology is the study of God's creation, the majesty of his work in fashioning humanity. Obviously, you've already declared how you're integrating the two, but could you describe how that core belief practically works its way into your daily classrooms?
Sure thing. I think that if things go really well in a biology classroom, or in any science classroom, it can almost turn into a worship service. I feel like the beauty of creation is so evident, is so clear that sometimes when I'm teaching students and they get it, they get what I'm trying to get across, there's like audible gasps. People, wow, when they hear what's happening there. Like we as humans and all creatures on this planet are fearfully and wonderfully made. And that beauty goes all the way down. It goes down from, in our ecosystems that we're part of, down to our bodies and our tissues, our cells, and our biomolecules that make us up. So when I'm teaching, the phrase, thanks be to God, is a regular refrain that shows up all the time. I say it probably too often in my classes, because even if we're discussing something like viruses or we're discussing genes, I like to use that to remind students that the thing we have up here on the board is God's handiwork. And that sense of gratitude or awe that we feel is calling us to a worship. So at the semester level, as I look at like the scope of a course overall, like my courses often involve reading papers or books by Christians who are in science, and then trying to call my students to make connections between that faith that they have on Sunday and then the content that we're learning in class.
That is fantastic. And I'm guessing you made it sound sort of casually, they pick it up, but I think they're picking up your passion as well. No
I
question
hope
about
so.
it. Yeah. I assume you're familiar with Smarter Every Day, the video,
I
YouTube
heard that. Yeah.
channel.
Oh, yeah, of course.
Yes. He's got the latest one he's got out is on the bacterial flagellum.
Mm-hmm.
And you mentioned these audible gasps. Check it out if you have time. But I just looked at this morning, it's about 8 or 9 minute mark. And I mean, he knows this guy is a rocket scientist, right? Not a
Mm-hmm.
biologist, but brilliant individual.
Yeah.
And he knows why he is investigating this topic, right? How amazing it is. And as a Christian, destined as a Christian, the divine design. But he's talking to one of his guys he's interviewing, and he stops and says, I'm getting emotional right now. He says that a
Wow.
couple of times. And
Sure.
later on, I've never heard him say this in one of his videos. He mentioned worship a couple of times.
Hmm.
That's the clearest he's been, but it was right in the moment. It was real time recording where he was getting emotional, and that's what you're describing can happen in with your students, which is just beautiful.
Mm-hmm.
That's
I had this
fantastic.
I had this moment, if you mind me sharing the story. In
Please.
graduate school, a professor was talking about an enzyme, hexokinase, and getting all the way into the details, excited, writing on the board about how many times faster it could happen, and without the enzyme, how many lifetimes the universe would take for it to happen. Now it happens tens of thousands of times a second. And he got to the end of it and he said, "Praise evolution." And of course, like that put me up a little bit, like that's a little weird. But then after I thought about it later, it made me think, who was talking about praising? Like, what was it about going through that process that made him want to praise something? And I think that like learning this material draws us to praise, and it's beautiful.
That is stunning. I almost audibly gasped when you said that because of course the begs the question, who are you praising?
That's right.
But you're also bringing out the idea that even somebody that doesn't have a God-based, creation-based understanding of these things are still in awe,
That's right.
and they maybe secretly think of God, perhaps not in many cases, but that's a stunning story.
Mhm.
Wow, wow. Yeah, I remember in organic chemistry class in college, and same sort of thing, right? Professors fills the board with uh, um, data which I can't recall, and he says, if this in all this complexity, if this one thing does not happen here, this chemical process, we're dead. And of course that's just
Yeah,
one of endless ones.
yeah,
So
innumerable.
yeah, we should be in awe. We're establishing this early on, and I absolutely love it. I didn't read in your bio all of your accomplishments and awards and so forth, but one that stood out is a few years ago you received the Trinity College Professor of the Year, which is a wonderful award to receive. And we've already sort of hinted at this, but I'm sure your students are appreciating this integration of science and faith. And if you have any more examples you can
Mhm.
think of in that regard.
Sure, that really was a great honor. The award specifically goes to people who show excellence in teaching, excellence in scholarship, and in particular, scholarship that informs teaching. And so around the time that that group of students nominated me for that, I was spending a couple of summers with a group called SCIO, or Scholarship in Christianity in Oxford, where they have this Bridging the Two Cultures organization, where they had a grant from the Templeton Foundation to try to bring together scientists and people in the humanities to think about these things and how they come together. And so I was spending my summers just deep into that and coming back, and it could not help but shape the way I taught the content in the classroom. It shaped the way I saw the science. So of course it shaped the way that I taught it. And I do think my students were receptive to that and appreciative for it, and that probably played a role in why they did the nomination.
Yeah, it's any professor, you students can tell, are they passionate about this? Do they care about me? Because I'm sure that's a large part of it as well. So congratulations on
Thank you.
that. For a lot of people, integrating faith and science is viewed as either just an absolute waste of time or for some, an affront to the entire scientific endeavor. So you've received some positive feedback from doing this, but also wondering if you've experienced any backlash, or maybe because you're in a Christian college, a little bit less so.
Yeah, so to be honest in this, when I face backlash for the way I've integrated science and faith, it has come exclusively from my brothers and sisters in Christ.
Ouch.
Yeah, people who don't like the way that I do it. I find that generally scientists who are kind of more secular in background or in practice, they see these conversations in science and faith, and then they recognize that that's not purely a science conversation anymore. It's a theology or maybe a philosophy conversation. And so
Worldview.
they just kind of look on and they stay quiet, interested. Some scientific organizations are really interested in reaching out to communities of faith. And so they are trying to build relationships and build trust between faith communities and between the scientific community. And so they actually are eager for scientists who are people of faith to step forward and do this kind of integration. Um, and so the scientists generally are either kind of removed from it and just let it happen, or they're eager for it and encourage it. But if I get angry comments under an essay that I write, or if someone sends an angry email to my superiors here at Trinity, it is exclusively from fellow Christians who have a different idea of how I ought to integrate science and faith.
That is a fascinating experience that I am surprised by, surprised but not surprised, and saddened by. Um, so there, if you could say, sort of in broad strokes, are these angry emails? Obviously, it's not that you're integrating faith and science, but how you're doing it. And
That's right.
imagine they want you to be sort of maybe more, uh, sort of the old Earth, young Earth debate.
That's right.
Do you get criticized probably more by the young Earthers?
That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah, that the whole idea of trying to do work in the area of trying to see the theological implications of the human microbiota is to do science and faith integration that moves beyond just fighting about origins. But those origin fights that are so important to some parts of the Christian community, they anytime someone does a science and faith integration, even when it's intentionally not that discussion, it still comes through.
Yeah, that's unfortunate. And that's a position I hold. So I know there's a lot of folks that overreact. So yeah, I'm sorry to hear that.
Hmm.
And as a pastor, I've had plenty of angry emails
I'm sure you
over the
have.
years. So I can relate to that as well.
Yeah.
Uh, what do Christians mean when we speak of divine design? So here's a new uh, uh, term here. And again, because this is not a Christian podcast per se, even though
Mhm.
I love to integrate these topics, many of our listeners may not have this theological background. So divine design, and how do you help your students see divine design in creation instead of, as we've been discussing, purposeless evolution?
Sure. So design is a tricky word because it has different meanings depending on who's saying it. And so, for example, like in those origin debates, one of the groups is the intelligent design community. And when they say design, they mean like a gotcha moment where they caught God in the act of creation. When they talk about irreducible complexity as a chance of seeing something that exists in nature that they would argue could not have possibly evolved. So therefore, it must come from a designer, which they typically leave vague, as opposed to like saying explicitly the Christian God designed it. Where in the meantime, there are secular physicists who would look at something like the fine-tuned universe hypothesis and might lead to a recognition that the universe seems to be remarkably well designed for human-like life to arise. So there they're talking about just a recognition of various constants in physics that have to be exactly the numbers that they are in order for life to exist. And so they are not trying to mean by that evidence that God created a specific thing. They're instead recognizing something that seems remarkably well suited for us to exist. And so, because of the ambiguity, I tend to avoid the word design. And instead, I cast a wider net that stresses whether this particular student sees these structures that we talk about in biology and say, well, this God created that in a moment, or even that God created this through billions of years of, in parentheses, divinely guided evolution, then clearly they are still beautiful and good, and for their creation, God is worthy of praise. And so I feel like doing that sort of wider uh, recognition of the beauty of it and the maker behind it, I hope diffuses some of the stress that's behind a word like design.
Oh, interesting. But obviously, in your environment, the designer is God, or
Of course.
Jesus. The
Hmm.
Bible is clear about that. But yeah, I appreciate that. I use a paradigm in my preaching and teaching that helps us to focus on the core issues, right? The
Yeah,
absolutes, and not the more debatable issues which cause unnecessary division. So it sounds like that's exactly what you're aiming at.
I'm trying to.
Yeah, trying to, exactly. Whether they get it or not is a different question. Yeah. Another sort of term that we will need to define, because it sort of impacts everything that we're going to be talking about, is what is called the creation fall narrative in the Bible. There was a creation, and there's what Christians call a fall, and that impacts all of life and science, from our perspective. Could you
Mhm.
speak about that for a moment?
I'd be happy to. So on the big bushy tree that is the tree of Christianity, I land on the Reformed branch, which just means that we continue to unpack that creation fall into what we call like a creation fall, redemption, new creation worldview. And it goes something like this. We recognize that this is God's good world, made and sustained by Creator God, that God in the opening pages of Genesis declares over and over that creation is good. But clearly, it's not all that it should be. That as part of that creative process, God's invited humans to be stewards, like caretakers of all creation, to help creation be what it could be. But instead, we chose sin. And therefore, since the caretakers have now chosen to go other ways, all of creation is less than it could be. But thanks be to God, all things are being made new in Christ Jesus. All things. That means that, yes, as a Christian, of course, I'm forgiven from my sins, thanks be to God. But the work of Jesus is so much bigger than just my sin. In Christ, all of creation is being freed from the frustration that it has faced under our sinful leadership. That includes mountains and meadows are being redeemed by God, schools and communities are being redeemed in Christ, and cells and microbes are being made new as well. So we today look forward to a time, a new creation, when all things are fully made new, when all relationships lift each other towards God, when all of creation shines under the leadership of its true King, Jesus.
Excellent summary. Thank you. Um, so creation fall. So before the fall, so creation was perfect, all things were good. Would you say something like the second law of thermodynamics, where everything descends into chaos and degradation, would not have been in effect before the fall? Something like that?
Yeah, so I don't think I can go there. It's hard for me to understand a world that would exist without the second law of thermodynamics, and so I can't go that far. In part because in Scripture, it's new creation that's perfect. Creation was just very good, and maybe that's a small semantic difference, but it seems important that the for whatever reason God chose to make the perfect creation later, that instead we start off with a very good one, invited humans to help make it even more, and we chose otherwise.
Yeah, and that's actually a fair answer because we really don't know. We're not told. I mean, you and I are guided fundamentally by the Bible, and we're not told that. There's an assumption that Adam and Eve and their progeny would live forever, but we don't know that. But what we do know is abundantly clear, as you say, in the new creation, new heavens and new earth, uh, we will live forever, and it will be, it cannot fall again,
That's right.
which is the wonder and beauty of it. Yeah.
Hmm.
I was 2 summers ago, I had my first sabbatical in my pastoral career
Hmm.
for a whole summer. It was just wonderful. And my
Sounds
wife
great.
and I, we live in this what's called the driftless area, rolling hills, very beautiful. So we're out for one of our walks, and I could not have been more relaxed, than I could be because I'm not working.
Yeah.
I'm exploring other things, and it's just a perfect evening. And in all of that, as good as it could be, sort of environment, I had this overwhelming feeling, this can't be all there is. Now,
Hmm.
I know that theologically, etc., but I experienced it so deeply. This cannot be all there is. We are made for much more, and I think that was just my heart longing for the
Yeah.
new creation.
I feel like sometimes seeing real beauty and nature like that is it shows like the promise of what will be, and it calls it to like, oh, okay, they can be this good. I cannot wait for what it will be.
Absolutely, yeah. You're probably familiar with John Piper.
Hmm.
Yeah, his sort of famous Grand Canyon illustration. You walk to the edge of the Grand Canyon and you don't look at it and say, wow, I'm so amazing. It's
That's
not
right.
the response it's supposed to give. It's no, that is amazing. And how did it get there
Yeah.
is the idea. So always something outside of ourselves.
Yeah.
Well, I discovered your work after reading an article you co-authored, and the title is Deeply Connected to God's Good World, the Human Microbiome. You're only, I'm still have a fledgling podcast here. You're only my ninth guest. And most of those episodes, I've tried to work in a statement about God in some manner without getting too preachy. And as a pastor, I can tend to get preachy. But with you, as we've already been doing, we could sort of go crazy with the title of this episode, Worshiping God Through the Wonders of the Microbiome. I'm wondering how, because this article looked a little different than some of the other articles that you wrote. So how'd you come to write this article?
Yeah. So my co-author for the paper was then a student named Michael Cunnin, and he was a very gifted student who was majoring in both biology and theology. So he's just already a gifted and thoughtful guy. And so he was in my microbiology course, and we ended up having a number of pretty interesting conversations thinking about the faith implications of the material we were learning in micro. And so I invited him to do an independent study with me. The idea was that we would think about these things intentionally together. And so for a whole semester, we met weekly. Each week, we had an assignment of different research articles from published on microbiota research that we were going to read. We would share them with each other. We would talk about the science of it and what it means. And then we would unpack it theologically, saying, what do we think this means given that creation, fall, redemption, new creation worldview that we just talked about? Um, if God's making all things new in Christ, then what does that mean for this research that we're talking about right here? This is God's good world made good and broken. How does that impact what we're reading here? And so the plan was that from our conversations, he was going to write a paper kind of for his independent project, and then I was going to write one that would work towards publication somewhere, like where it ended up in Christian Scholars Review. And in the end, our two papers merged and informed each other so much that we decided to publish as co-authors.
Oh, that's great. I would have given anything to co-author something with you like that. That sounds really rewarding.
It was a great
So
experience.
yeah, I bet. Have you had an extra interest in the microbiome because you teach very broadly, obviously within all of biology. So how much of that has been an interest?
Yeah. So I'm at a small institution, and so we have to teach broadly. There's only so many of us, and biology is huge. And so, as in so many things, when you ask professors, it's the students that show us the way. And so, when I'm teaching microbiology, I also think that flagella are really interesting, and my students get it, and they smile and nod. But when we talk about the microbiota, they come to the edge of their seat, and they come alive, and they're curious, as interested. They have lots and lots of follow-up questions. They line up after class to ask, what about this? What about that? What about this? And so that then pushes all of us to keep digging in more and getting closer and learning more. Um, then, of course, I'm sure you've had the experience too that we have people in our life that have issues that are either from microbiota problems or solved by microbiota research. And so, the intersection of the health of ourselves or our loved ones, and then the inherent interest and beauty of the content, the students' enthusiasm for the topic, together, it's irresistible not to want to go and learn more and more and more about these topics.
That is remarkable. And I wonder two things. The microbiome research, as you know, is just growing exponentially, and
Hmm.
it seems like it's going to continue on that trajectory. But also, what can you clue us in a little bit? Are there any types of questions in particular that they have that they're drawn toward?
The students.
Yes, to students in
Yeah, yeah,
those
yeah.
environments.
Like everybody else, and I suspect we'll get there in our conversation. They want to know what they can do to have a healthier microbiota,
Mm.
and that's the question that we're all pursuing and hoping for an easy answer. I'm not sure one exists, and so trying to find
Listening
a
to the
healthier way to
Resilient
live.
Biome podcast might be one way to do that.
There you go. It's a good step in the right direction.
Sorry, interrupt your thought.
No, that I think that that's part of what interests them. The other is that this is something that they, in high school and elementary school, they get to learn all about the details of the cardiovascular system or the lungs and how they work. But the microbiological system we carry around is, just as important, and it's one that they just know so much less about.
I would argue that, and you don't want to say, what is most important, but the microbiome, as you know, impacts every organ,
Yeah,
every disease. So if you want a healthy heart, you have to have a healthy gut. If you want a healthy
that's right.
brain, you just go down the list.
Yep.
That's one of the things that has been the most stunning to me. And I love the fact that they want to know how to be healthier. That's really interesting.
Hmm.
One of the things we talk about, what leads us to worship, and again, as you said, and I've said, the mountains and the Grand Canyon and bacterial flagellum. So we have a broad spectrum there. One of the things that has really amazed me is this. Um, I guess it's a molecule, if I'm using that word right. HMO, human milk oligosaccharide, a medium chain sugar is what it is, and it's the
Hmm.
third most abundant ingredient in breast milk. And the reason I got into that is, among other things, 4 out of 8 of my episodes have focused on the infant microbiome
Hmm.
and seeing how that can set, as I said, the microbiome affects your organ systems. Also, the earlier your gut is healthy, the healthier the entire rest of your life will be, which is that's a part of passion of mine for people to understand. So it's a third most ingredient in breast milk for infants, and it accomplishes absolutely nothing for the infant. Its only purpose, I'm going to use design,
Go ahead.
divinely designed, created, is to feed the healthy microbiomes in the infant's gut. And that to me is stunning. I even weave this into a sermon at one time. And that's, of course, just one of many, many that lead me to greater worship. So I'm wondering, what are some of your favorite topics within the microbiome that have amazed you?
Yeah, happy to discuss this, of course. We can do a couple, and I'll try not to do too much.
Oh,
Uh,
please.
so the first area is one that I think is incredibly interesting to me and to everyone who hears about it, but awkward to discuss, which starts with the vaginal microbiota. That I recently taught a topics course, seminar style, on the human microbiota. So we dedicated a week to talking about different ecosystems in the human body. I work at a private liberal arts college, so my ratio of students is tilted towards more females than males. And in my class, we then spent a whole week talking about the vaginal microbiota, and they learn things there like, people have different community state types, which are like different bacteria that are the predominant microbes in the vagina, and they're not all equally beneficial. That CST, they call it type 1, is predominantly made up of this one type of lactobacillus that's hugely beneficial. It makes the pH really low, so no other pathogens can live there. It leads to the thick protective tissues so that the bacteria that live there don't actually interact with the body. It's anti-inflammatory. And then there's other types, like this type 4, that maybe like 1 in 4 women are walking around with. That's not at all protective, but instead it has a higher pH, makes it easier for pathogens to grow, more likely to have yeast infections or bacteriosis or other things. And so I teach this to my students, and immediately they're all, well, I want to know what type I am. How do I find out what type I am? And I think that that's so interesting. I hope that we can come to a point not only where women are able to learn which type they are, but then learn ways to try to fostering the more beneficial types of microbes. And so that is kind of a window into what is almost certainly my favorite topic, which is all of the goodness that happens at birth. And so, because you've spent so many of your episodes talking about infant microbiota, I'm sure you're well familiar, but we'll review anyway because it's so fun. That during pregnancy, a woman's body undergoes a host of changes, one of which is real high estrogen levels Those estrogen levels lead to a whole bunch of physiological and biological changes in the woman's body, getting ready for carrying, delivering, and then nursing the baby. But one that I think is so fascinating is that she begins to secrete glycogen into her vaginal cavity. And so glycogen is an energy storage molecule. It's it's like the starch of animals, just a way of storing sugars. And now, as she's getting ready to go through one of the biggest marathons of her life, delivering this baby into the world, instead of storing that glycogen, she's shedding it, pumping it into the vaginal cavity. And so that seems to make no sense. But as I just discussed, one of the bacteria that live there, from the genus Lactobacillus, is very, very good at eating that glycogen. And in so doing, their population explodes. And as it explodes, it drives the pH down so low that basically no pathogens can live there anymore. And so this one bacteria takes over. And then at the moment of birth, that baby is baptized in lactobacillus, so that as this baby's body begins to learn how to relate to the microbes that will cover it its entire life, the first interaction it has is with one of the most beneficial bacteria we know. So when I hear that story, I think, like the human milk oligosaccharides that you talked about, it's more evidence of God's bountiful provision, even in the invisible. God at work blessing us through creation, even when we knew nothing of it. There's one
I have
example.
to, yeah, thank you. I have to use a church word here. Amen to that. Fantastic. Is that Lactobacillus rhamnosus that you're referring to?
Not rhamnosus. It's actually cryptaceous is the most beneficial of the lactobacilli that live in the vagina. And then there's, like I said, the different CSTs or community state types. There's a couple other lactobacilli that are present in groups. I think it's 2 and 5 or something like that. And then that one type that is, its defining characteristic is it's not lactobacilli that are living there. And that's where the problem comes from.
That's a species I am not familiar with, so thank you for that. Are you
Hmm.
familiar with Tiny Health, the
Uh,
gut testing?
no, tell me more.
Yeah, so it was one of my earlier podcasts, and they do what's called shotgun metagenomics, which is
Hmm.
the most, as you know, the most detailed. It can go down to species, subspecies, and strain level,
Hmm.
and they also test the vaginal microbiome. There might
Nice.
be others that do that, but they do, and we had a wonderful discussion in this same realm. So not only are we saying that you need to make sure your infant's microbiome is healthy, but the best way to do that is to make sure that the
Yeah,
vaginal microbiome is healthy, which now you're in a prenatal thing, prenatal situation. And you did mention, but one of the pathogens that they watch out for is GBS or group beta strep. And
mhm,
as you said, it lactobacillus and others lowers the pH, which again that happens also in the gut microbiome.
that's right.
That's what the healthy microbiome do. So I love how you handle that in a delicate way, but also the interest that your students have, and they're hearing things they have never heard,
That's right.
and they probably wouldn't hear in almost any university level. That's really exciting. Wow.
So another
And
one that it's of
please,
interest
oh
to me,
yeah,
want me to keep going,
yeah,
is thinking about the way that our various ecosystems are established. And so one just like to zoom in on is thinking about like the oral microbiota, starting with that pre-birth, likely no bacteria living there at all. By age 2 or so, most people have pretty similar mouth microbiota. And so how do we get from one to the other? And so there's like the ecosystem formation, the microbial progression that I'm sure you've covered in other episodes, of where one microbe will come and then it's living there makes an ecosystem, ecological niche for the next microbe to come. And that one then helps shape the community further and so on, so that eventually the mouth microbiota forms. And so I see something really beautiful in the way that so few things impact the oral mouth microbiota. For example, like socioeconomic status, race, culture, number of siblings, even the formation of teeth. Don't None of those have any real impact on the microbes that live in the mouth. Each baby's mouth has can be really different from each other, even really different from their mom, from their siblings. But then around the time we start introducing solid foods, all of these different babies, the different oral microbiotas tend to like narrow in on one consistent set of inhabitants that live in everybody's mouth. And so I see in that a suggestion of the way God often works in the world, that like there's no magical moment in the microbial development where someone has to like add this bacteria to the mouth so that they have it. So despite like a million individual choices of what dirt or piece of rug that kid puts in their mouth, despite all those different opportunities, it ends up in the exact shape it needs to be in. There's no one shaping the oral microbiota, but it ends up in exactly right shape. And I see a lot of similarities in my own life, that I don't have very many stories of God grabbing me by the shoulders and shaking me to where I need to be, but by the grace of God, I've ended up right where he called me to be. Thanks be to God.
Yeah, wonderful. And I did not know that about the oral microbiome. That sounds a little different from the gut microbiome, because my understanding is all of those environments and changes that you mentioned do radically impact the gut microbiome.
That's right.
So
Yep.
I had no idea that the oral microbiome would be so different.
Hmm.
Yeah, fascinating. And as you know, and I'm sure you've told your students, if you don't floss your teeth, you are more likely to get Alzheimer's, as an example, right? Gum
Wild,
disease,
isn't it?
leaky gums is like leaky gut, is like
Hmm.
leaky skin. I just did a video on the skin microbiome,
Hmm.
and yeah, how important that is. So, to sort of frighten your students, right?
That's right.
Floss your
Scare him
teeth
into it.
into it. Yeah.
Yeah.
I need that to be consistent.
Should we
Flossing
do
my
one more
teeth.
example?
Please.
All right. So I think if I had a third example of where I just can't shake the sense of awe, it would be in the T regulatory cells of our immune system. Um, the immune system is already mind-blowing. It's easily one of the most complicated things in the whole universe, maybe second to the human brain. It has the ability, to make more different unique antibodies than there are stars in the sky. To say that our body makes
Wow.
an astronomical number of antibodies is actually an understatement. It's far more than that.
Hmm.
And that's already amazing. The fact that we have these hunter cells stalking through our bloodstream looking for prey. The fact that we have cells that are actually called natural killer cells, cells that are pre-programmed to murder our cells, but they get paused at the last second over and over when our tissue shows, actually, I'm healthy, please leave me be. So the immune system is already incredible in its complexity and its beauty and the way it keeps us safe. But I think T regulatory cells go one step further. They're the part of the immune system that tells the rest of the immune fighters to lay down their swords and be at peace. I think they're proof that fighting an immune response is not always the healthiest way for our body to respond to microbes. And sure enough, the largest concentration of T regulatory cells in the body, as you likely know, is along the colon. And presumably what they're doing there is keeping our immune system from overreacting to the billions of microbes that we house there. And so I see a lot of redemption in that. Even in a system like our immune system that is built for killing, it can still be set to balance, a balance that leads to mutual flourishing of both the microbes and of me. And so if it can happen in my cells, then please, Lord, let it happen in my life too.
And by happening in your life, you mean flesh that out
Let
for a minute.
me find the balanced ways to live mutually with my neighbors and my community.
Yeah. Oh, that's wonderful. Yeah. Um, the oh, what was I going to say? Anyway, I'm going to mess up what you said if I say too much there. That's some new. Oh, I know what I was going to say. most people are familiar with when you think of the immune system overreacting, it would be COVID, right?
Sure.
The so-called cytokine
Cytokine storm, yeah.
storm. That one is you can more quickly wrap your head around it maybe than that because you can't see what's going on in your gut exactly the same. But yeah, that's wonderful. This question might be somewhat from it. Hopefully, it's not like the second law of thermodynamics question. It might be similar, but in the article that you wrote, you said this: human beings were created in right relationship with the microbiota, living both on and inside them. However, when humans chose to sin and disobey God, that's the fall, these relationships were disrupted by the corruptive effects of the fall. So, I'd like you to flesh this out for us, if you would. Are you saying that, for example, we're talking about pathogenic strains of bacteria? Not all E. coli are pathogenic, some are. COVID, Ebola, they were in the original creation. So, would you say they were harmless before the fall?
Yeah. My official answer has to be, I don't know. Um, but that's a very short answer. We have time. So, um, I mean, scientifically, it looks like death has been part of creation for a very long time, since the beginning. So I just don't know for sure. But there are little hints, little like examples that maybe like something like that had come to be. For example, the difference between the friendly E. coli that we all need as part of our gut community and hemorrhagic E. coli that can kill us through food poisoning is the bacteria's ability to produce a toxin that comes from a completely different bacteria, the Shiga toxin. And so the versions of E. coli
Sorry, real
that,
quick. The Shiga toxin, does that come from Shigella?
yeah,
Wow, I didn't know that.
yeah. And so these
Fascinating.
are now like friendly E. coli making this toxin that comes from a completely different bacteria. And so the versions of E. coli that cause this deadly cases of food poisoning have genes for making the toxin, but they don't even normally carry it in their genome. Instead, they carry those genes on this small separate piece of DNA called a plasmid. And so, in my mind, that little example looks a lot like there was a normal, safe version of a bacteria that has somehow become corrupted and now leads to death and suffering. So, I don't take an example like that and say this is evidence of my claim in the paper, but I think it's an interesting hint of the kind of things we would see if it were true.
Yeah, and that leads into another question I was thinking about. Another one of those is Bacteroides fragilis, which
Hmm.
can be pretty common in the gut microbiome, and and you sort of implied this with the E. coli. It can be beneficial in certain amounts and in certain strains, etc. But clearly can become pathogenic, and a couple of the infants that were highlighted in my earlier episodes, that was their main culprit. They had one of them up to 50% of their microbiome was
Well,
just this B. fragilis. So is it similar to what you're discussing? Simply too much of a good thing, or would you say it's quite likely this sort of changes that happened after the fall?
hmm Um, looking at all of biology at different kind of levels, from ecosystems to microbiology, apparently part of what God sees as good in creation is diverse and balanced ecosystems. So I think a lot of times when discussing the microbiota, shifting to a kind of ecosystem that I can see makes it easier. And so, like a forest with numerous species of trees, with multitude of bird species in the airs, an array of other little creatures scurrying around in the earth, is healthy. It's stable. They mutually benefit each other. It's perhaps in God's language good. But if that same forest is instead just an unbroken tangle of buckthorn, an invasive that's really bad here in the Chicago area, if it's overseen by just one flock of crows, maybe it's not good. Crows are fine and they play an important role in the ecosystem, but the forest isn't healthy if they're the only birds around. And so I think the same seems to be true in our microbial communities, that when we are looking for examples of gut communities or other microbiota in the body that are healthy, they're typically large and diverse with lots of different species living there. And in almost all examples, when we start seeing that diversity shrink and few bacteria take over, it's a sign of dysbiosis. It's a sign that something has gone wrong and this is now an antagonistic or unhealthy relationship. I would add that the vaginal microbiota we talked about earlier is one distinct disexample. It's a place where having actually just one or two kinds of lactobacilli is actually beneficial, but it's the exception that proves the point. In
Mm.
all other systems, it seems to be that when there's a lot of things living there in balance with each other, that's what not only do the physicians call good, but I think God does too.
Yeah, wonderful. Yeah, and the gut microbiome, as you know, we know a lot about the gut microbiome, but there's we also are very ignorant so far, but it seems to be that most people agree that more diversity is always better. The
Right.
challenge is which uh species, which genus and which species are the most beneficial, but
That's right.
more diversity tends to be good for sure. This is more of a soil microbiome example, but I am also in awe and worship of the mycorrhizal network
Yeah.
of trees and how they communicate, this vast network that flows from the roots, and the mother trees can send nutrients to the smaller trees and they benefit each other. And of course the fungus that's made of is benefiting mutually from the
That's
trees.
right.
So these kind of examples, we could multiply them endlessly.
Yeah.
So amazing. In your article, you state the need for humility when studying the microbiome. As I just said, there's so much we don't know, and
That's
the
right.
fact that you have said multiple times, I don't know, I'm not sure, that's indicative of your humility as well. Related to the topic humility, I was shocked to see recently an article in the Wall Street Journal stated that a 217-year-old publishing company is, now I'm quoting, is closing 19 journals, some of which were infected by large-scale research fraud. In the past 2 years, Wiley, that's the one in question, has retracted more than 11,300 papers that appeared compromised. So just a staggering thing, and you're in the
Yeah.
research realm as well. How can the Christian virtue of humility restore faith in scientific research, whether it's related to the microbiome or not?
Mm. Yeah. Um, yeah, I have a friend named Josh Reeves. He's down at Samford University, and he wrote a book on this exact topic. It's called Redeeming Expertise, Scientific Trust in the Future of the Church.
Oh
I
my
recommend
goodness.
it if your listeners are curious about this topic. Um, and I think that, the truth is that we need scientific experts doing science, just like we need engineering experts building bridges. But because humans still choose to sin, not just we did sin, but we still choose to sin, sometimes shoddy building practices lead to bridges that fail. In science, there has been too much faith, I think, in the integrity of everybody in the system, including the scholars and the reviewers and the publishers and even the readers. Like everybody else, scientists mostly, I think, do the right thing, but sometimes they don't. And so I think we need systems that can help try to catch people and hold people accountable to be their best selves the way that I really believe they want to be. If there's any silver lining in those that heartbreaking quote you read, it would be that they were caught. Science doesn't always get things right, and sometimes bad science gets published, but science is a self-correcting discipline. That the things that are proven true over and over in labs across the world are cited more often or rise to the top that become integrated into medical systems and into the textbooks and teach the next generation. And those that don't. Instead, sometimes they get called out, as has happened here, or worst case scenario, they fade away as it's proven over time to not be helpful. It kind of slides into the cracks and disappears. Um, so I think we need to trust the experts, but we also need to recognize that the experts are still just humans, same as us. Scientists aren't like inherently better people. They're just people who are good at science.
And as you know, I'm sure there is pressure to publish, right? The old phrase,
Of
publish or
course.
perish.
Yep.
So that demand can cause you to cut corners. Does your friend Josh, are there some solutions that he offers that stand out to hold people accountable?
He doesn't get too much into the accountability part. He instead kind of builds in practices for us as the church. Instead, think about avoiding conspiratorial thinking, encouraging critical thinking in our own part, um, keeping in mind things that scientists can't speak to. Just because they're good at science doesn't mean they're good at all things. Those sorts of things.
Got it. Wait, are you saying there's conspiratorial thinking in the church sometimes?
Yes.
Rhetorical question. I agree. I know that
Yeah.
all too well. Dr. Carlson, this has been even more I knew this was going to be enjoyable. It's been even more enjoyable than anticipated, and that's thanks to you. I'm starting to get in a habit of asking a final question of my guests, and since this is the Resilient Biome podcast, wondering what is your top recommendation that our listeners can do to have a more resilient gut microbiome?
Yeah, it seems like the more science comes out of the gut microbiota, the wiser my mother seems. For a resilient microbiome, our best steps are just to eat well and exercise. Anyone who follows the science hoping for some sort of magic pill is going to be very disappointed. Instead, the microbiota researchers shed more light than ever onto the importance of eating fresh fruits and vegetables, of avoiding highly processed foods, of eating meats in moderation. So if you want a really resilient microbiome, I can't give much better recommendation than have a salad for lunch and go for a walk. It seems like not only we need it, but so do our microbes. And that's just how God made us.
Oh, that's awesome. Sort of depends on what your mom was feeding you, though. I mean,
Ah!
I grew up, in the 60s and 70s, and it was all processed food. So,
But
but
she
your point
probably
is still
still
well
told you.
taken.
That's right. She probably still told you to eat your vegetables.
Sure, sure. I'm not sure. But yeah, I often say you can't out supplement a bad diet. You can't
That's right.
out exercise a bad diet. So
Mm-mm.
it really, really is the key. So
That's
that's
right.
a great word, a great way to end. So Dr. Carlson, I wish you your classes are ramping up here very shortly.
There's yeah, getting started next week.
Getting started next week. So only a couple more days to prepare for that. But I wish you a great semester and thank you so much for being with us.
Hey, thank you so much for having me. Blessings to all your listeners.
You as well. Yep.